Hi, I'm Clark Murdoch. I'm the director for the project on nuclear issues here at CSIS. Just a couple of words about PONI itself. It started in 2003. It's an effort to create a network community of young professionals and to try to encourage new thinking about nuclear issues. We have over 1,000 members now. We've also added a new mission, which is to help facilitate the development of the next generation of leaders across the nuclear enterprise. And as part of that, we've started for the first time this last year what was referred to as the Next Generation Working Group. I, as a resident member of the Old Farts Forum, originally called them the Young Professionals, but I've since found out that young professionals like to be called Next Generation Working Group. The first thing we did was find two chairmen for this to cross both the policy and the technical community. James Actin, to my immediate left, is the scientist, the technical person. He's a senior associate in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment. And to his left is Michael Gerson, who is an analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses. And these two, along with some facilitation from John Warden back there, who is our point person for CSIS on this effort, brought together a group of 14 young professionals who essentially formed a congressional commission or a congressionally endowed commission type of organization and engaged in a study on looking at next steps in arms control beyond New START. And this process went on all of last year. I'm afraid it took us some time over the summer to get complete clearances for the publication of this report and to get it published as well, but I'm delighted to say that it is now out in print, and this is its public unveiling. And subsequently, we've had a couple of meetings already, but we'll try to bring this report to the attention of senior decision makers throughout the U.S. government. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce James Actin and Michael Gerson. They'll give you a brief summary of the report, which I believe everybody has a copy of, and take questions. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Clark, and thank you all for coming. Before beginning, James and I just wanted to take a moment just to thank a couple of people who have been so important to this process. First, of course, is Clark Murdoch, who came up with this idea and provided important guidance and advice throughout the process, as well as an important critique of the draft that strengthened it tremendously. Second person we'd like to thank is John Warden. John not only served as a great contributor and member of the Next Generation Working Group, or as we call it, the NGWG, but also facilitated all the meetings, organized the travel that we did to Moscow, to Sandia, to Los Alamos, to the Nevada test site, and both in substance and in logistically working the end at CSIS. He's been a tremendous help to this. Finally, we wanted to thank the outside experts. As part of this process, as part of this group, we invited a few experts to come meet with us to talk through our ideas, to work through the things that we were thinking, provide their own guidance and advice. So we'd like to thank Chris Ford, Jeffrey Lewis, Frank Miller, and Ambassador Linton Brooks. Also wanted to extend a special thanks to Ambassador Brooks, who also graciously commented on a near final draft and provided very useful insights that I think strengthened the final product tremendously. First, a brief note about the Next Generation Working Group, or as again, the NGWG. It consists of, including James and myself, 14 young professionals. As James and I sort of thought about putting this together, we wanted to create bring people in with a variety of backgrounds and professional affiliations. So we have people from government, from NGOs, from academia, and from various think tanks in Washington and elsewhere, in addition to, as Clark already alluded to, people with both technical and sort of political and strategic expertise. It's important to note that all participants in the working group are participating in the group as in their personal capacity, so any of the views and analysis and recommendations in the report are solely those of the authors and of the group, and don't represent the views of their employers or institutions to which they're affiliated. For James and I, the central objective of this report was to get agreement on the general thrust of our recommendations and conclusions. We thought it was unwise to try to get everybody to agree to absolutely every word in every recommendation. So we decided on a sort of a language that said we wanted everyone to agree with the general thrust of the analysis and recommendations. It's also important to note that we offered an opportunity to the group to present any dissenting views, and if anyone dissented with some recommendation in the report, we would provide them an opportunity to dissent, and we'd publish it in the back of the report. Fortunately, none chose to do so. James and I worked extremely hard to craft language and develop recommendations and conclusions that everyone from a variety of political backgrounds and points of view could agree to. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about the opening parts of the value and objectives of arms control, and talk a little bit about U.S. and Russian interests in the next round, and then I'll stop there, and James will pick it up with providing some insight into the sort of basic conclusions, our key recommendations and conclusions from the report. So a key starting point in our work was that the fundamental objective of arms control with Russia is to enhance U.S. national security and the security of its allies. As such, we do not advocate arms control merely as an end in itself or advocate arms control for arms control's sake. Rather, we see it as a means by which the United States can increase its security. And this idea of increasing U.S. national security and the security of its allies is the sort of central metric by which one should judge an arms control agreement. Now, how does arms control contribute to strategic stability? How does arms control contribute to national security? Most important, arms control can be used to enhance strategic stability between the United States and Russia. Now, of course, there's been much discussion about the concept of strategic stability of late, so I'll talk a little bit about how we thought about it. The NGWG sees strategic stability as a sort of encompassing two key components: arms race stability and crisis stability. We define arms race stability broadly as a condition in which neither side has an incentive to build up its arsenal. And we define crisis stability as an enduring condition in which neither the United States nor Russia has or perceives an incentive to use nuclear weapons out of the fear that delay might lead to the other side gaining some advantage by using nuclear weapons first. According to this sort of definition of crisis stability and our broader conception of strategic stability, crisis stability includes but is not limited to first strike stability. So we sort of subsume that concept underneath it, recognizing that crisis stability is a much broader concept. So arms control, based on these sort of definitions, arms control contributes to strategic stability with Russia in two key ways. The first is through arms control, the United States and Russia can build and maintain confidence in the survivability of their respective nuclear forces. Indeed, a central component of stability between the United States and Russia under current and foreseeable conditions is that both sides should have forces that are sufficiently survivable such that neither side could gain a meaningful advantage by striking first. This is a really important sort of idea in that the idea of sort of mutual survivable forces and second strike capabilities kind of underpins for us the whole concept of strategic stability between the United States and Russia. And this is actually important for the real world because this has real world consequences, because a lack of confidence in the survivability of their respective forces for either the United States or Russia could weaken U.S. security, for example, by generating incentives to build up arms, to rectify these perceived vulnerabilities. Perceived lack of confidence could generate possibilities for miscalculations or miscommunications, particularly with regard to the intent of one of these arms buildups. It can exacerbate broader geopolitical tensions, be seen as a sign of one side attempting to break out of a condition of mutual vulnerability. And perhaps most importantly, in a severe crisis, it can generate preemptive pressures. One side might fear, whether real or imagined, that the other side was going to strike first. So for all these reasons, mutual confidence in the survivability of each side's strategic forces is an essential underpinning of strategic stability. Thus, arms control, by placing limitations and constraints on certain capabilities and by privileging others, can be used to encourage and codify force structures and deployment patterns that favor a stable strategic relationship. The second way that arms control contributes to strategic stability is by enhancing transparency. The NGWG believes that appropriate transparency can make a significant contribution to stability. Specifically, knowledge of the size, composition, and attributes of each side's nuclear forces, as well as a better understanding of the future trajectory of that force, the way in which it may or may not be heading, provides an important degree of predictability in U.S.-Russian relations. Predictability enhances stability for the United States by counteracting the tendency to base force planning on worst-case assumptions. So we firmly believe that transparency is an important objective, and that through arms control, through the verification mechanisms and all these kinds of things that we temporarily lost with the expiration of START and got back with New START are really important objectives in the next round. There are a number of additional benefits as well, besides, I think, this core benefit of enhancing strategic stability. More broadly, arms control is a valuable tool for maintaining and strengthening U.S.-Russian relations writ large. We see that there's important value and great benefit to the arms control process, the negotiations themselves, the long, often contentious series of discussions and debates that lead, hopefully, to a final agreement. That process has great value as it provides a way in which to learn more about each other's views, better understand strategic cultures and perspectives, better interpret what each other is doing, and potentially discuss other issues of mutual interest. In addition, further arms control between the United States and Russia can contribute to nonproliferation. While arms control agreements, and for that matter, individual U.S. or Russian decisions on their nuclear forces are unlikely to have a direct effect on the nuclear decisions of countries like North Korea or Iran, further arms control could be useful in garnering greater international support for nonproliferation efforts. Indeed, many of the measures required to enhance the nonproliferation regime, tougher sanctions, tighter export controls, strengthened safeguards, require sort of broad support and often participation in and from the international community. Nevertheless, as many of you know, many non-nuclear member states of the NPT often base their lack of support or lack of great vigorous support for nonproliferation efforts on the grounds that the United States and Russia have not done enough to fulfill their Article 6 NPT commitments. We disagree whether or not that's a real, within the NGWG there was a great debate as to whether or not this was a real thing or not, but nevertheless we saw it as important enough to include in the report such that further U.S. Russian arms control could be an important and tangible signal of the U.S. commitment to the U.S. and Russian commitment to Article 6, and thus potentially create greater incentives for non-nuclear member states to contribute more greatly to international nonproliferation efforts. And there's a specific benefit, a very particular benefit to the next round of arms control, which is to reduce the dramatic disparity in tactical nuclear weapons. Of course, based on publicly available sources, Russia deploys considerably larger number of TNWs as well as they're on a more diverse number of systems. We identified sort of three ways in which negotiations on TNW in the next round, hopefully an agreement, could contribute to national security. The first is that negotiations and hopefully an agreement on TNW could increase confidence in the United States of effective security of Russian TNWs against theft, diversion, or accidents. So increased security is a sort of first one of Russian TNWs. The second is there's considerable uncertainty regarding the size and disposition of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons, as well as what role they actually play in Russia's operational military doctrine. And so thus arms control can increase transparency in these important areas, by giving the United States a better handle on exactly how many there are, where they are, and how they factor into Russia's thinking about deterrence, and if deterrence fails, warfighting. And finally, an agreement on reductions would by reducing this dramatic asymmetry, could help reduce the perceived threat of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons to some of our allies. We pointed out perceived threat as an important element of that language. Some countries are more threatened by Russia's TNW than others. We decided not to sort of get into that debate, but nevertheless say that by reducing that asymmetry in TNW arsenal, we could help make some of our allies that are threatened by these capabilities, or perceived to be, or feel threatened, potentially more secure. So going into the next round, one of the challenges of this round in particular is that U.S. Russian interests, objectives, and capabilities are more asymmetric than in past arms control efforts. Whereas past arms control negotiations dealt with issues, the issues under discussion, dealt with things that were relatively equal in number, rough numbers of warheads and delivery vehicles. The issues for discussion in the next round encompass capabilities in which one side has a significant advantage over the other. And as such, given this dramatic asymmetry, issues must be linked together. So the U.S., in order for this next round to continue, the United States must be willing to address Russia's concerns in one area in which the United States has a great advantage, such as ballistic missile defense, in order to convince Moscow to address U.S. concerns in an area in which they have a significant advantage, such as TNW. So it's that important linkage, and that idea of these issue linkages is sort of a fundamental theme running through this report, that given one side has a great advantage in one area, the other side has an advantage in the other. They have to be willing to address each other's concerns in areas where they both have great advantage in order to make some progress in the next round. So what are U.S. objectives? We identified essentially two central objectives for the United States in the next round. The first is to shape U.S. and Russian forces in ways that enhance strategic stability. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we have one thing in particular that I'll touch on a little bit, and James may come back to, which is the issue of silo-based MIRVed ICBMs. From our perspective, these are particularly dangerous capabilities, silo-based MIRVed ICBMs. And the reason is because a strike against an opponent's MIRVed ICBMs would destroy more warheads than were used in the attack, thereby allowing the side that initiated the attack to shift the balance of forces in a favorable direction. Thus, MIRVed ICBMs could create preemptive pressures on both sides. One side fearing that they're about to be struck may use them. The other side wanting to achieve this great advantage may have a particular incentive to strike first in a severe crisis. It's also, I should point out that as a general sort of view, we sort of thought that it's unlikely that nuclear weapons are going to be used in the future. We hope that it's relatively unlikely. But nevertheless, if they're going to be used, it's likely to be in the context of an intense crisis. And thus, crisis stability and strategic stability is one of the important windows through which we sort of looked at all these issues. So hence this sort of issue of the silo-based MIRVed ICBM being potentially destabilizing and dangerous. So based on that, we spent a lot of time thinking about the silo-based MIRVed ICBMs, and this is one concrete way in which the United States could use the next round of arms control to shape each side's forces in ways that enhance stability. In particular, one of the concerns that we had was news reports that Russia is considering and has released potentially some funding for a new heavy ICBM. That is a liquid-fueled, silo-based ICBM equipped with many MIRVs. This new capability, ostensibly designed to replace the aging SS-18, poses problems for strategic stability and for U.S. and Russian security in this context. It's indeed the idea that Russia would release funding and consider thinking about a new silo-based liquid MIRVed ICBM is in some ways inconsistent with its own recent emphasis on strategic stability, that the Russians now sort of emphasize strategic stability as an important objective, and then yet to go off and potentially build a new capability that would exacerbate strategic stability is somewhat inconsistent. Indeed, Russia says that they're concerned about conventional prompt global strike and the counterforce capability of high-precision conventional weapons. Well, if that's true, then building a vulnerable silo-based weapon that has lots of eggs in that basket is sort of inconsistent with that thinking. Moreover, if Russia is concerned about U.S. BMD as potentially undermining their deterrent, building a liquid-fueled missile which accelerates more slowly will only exacerbate those problems and compound those fears by giving the United States potentially the capability to intercept those missiles early in flight. The second U.S. objective is to reduce the disparity in tactical nuclear weapons. As you all know, the Senate's resolution of advice and consent said that negotiations on TNW must be a principal, although not only, focus of the next round of arms control. It's important to note that for Russia, negotiations on tactical nuclear weapons is not a high priority issue. They seem to have signaled interest in negotiations, but also held to their long line that TNWs must be stored solely on the owner's territory before negotiations can begin. thus creating problems with the United States and our NATO allies. Bottom line is the NGWG believes that the U.S. should not withdraw tactical nuclear weapons prior to negotiations, but we do believe that it should consider withdrawal of some or all of its TNWs supposedly based in Europe as part of an overall outcome, as long as the benefits outweigh the cost. So thus the NGW believes that withdrawal should only be considered if accompanied by some alternative form of burden sharing between the United States and NATO and some other kind of symbol for the U.S. commitment. So we're not opposed to the idea of a reduction, but we do believe that there must be tangible security benefits accrued by that reduction, and that there does need to be some alternative sort of way in which the United States and its NATO allies share the nuclear burden and also provide some sort of tangible signal both to allies and potential adversaries of the U.S. commitment to NATO. So I'll finally just briefly talk about Russian objectives. We sort of identified 3 primary Russian objectives in the next round. They're relatively obvious. The first is limiting U.S. BMD. The second is limiting U.S. conventional prompt global strike capabilities, whatever form they may or may not take. And the third is to reduce the U.S. advantage in upload potential. In addition to these 3, which we assess as sort of likely objectives, there's also one other possible one, which is that Russia may insist on linking in addressing the conventional balance in Europe and future of CFE into the negotiations. We sort of say that's a possible Russian objective. We're just not sure if they link it in. From our perspective, from the group's perspective, we're hopeful they don't, as that will only add one more complicated issue to an already set of potentially insurmountable issues. But nevertheless, if Russia insists upon linking this in, then we may not have a choice in doing so. So, you know, the issues, of course, with BMD are well known. It's primarily the later stage, phase 4 of the phase adaptive approach with the Block 2B, which, according to the paper assessment, has the potential to intercept missiles early in flight in the ascent phase. And the second on CPGS, of course, New START limits some capabilities and, you know, warheads on conventional warheads on existing systems, but nevertheless, the United States seems to be going towards boost glide, which the United States claims would not be accountable under New START, and Russia may have some objectives there, some objections there. And of course, reducing the disparity in upload potential. This is an important one and gets to an important recommendation that we have in the report that James will talk about, which is that given the differences in the way in which the United States and Russia sort of maintain their arsenals, the United States has a considerably larger hedge than Russia. And the hedge is, of course, against technical failure or geopolitical surprise. And that hedge, that reserve force, could potentially in a crisis allow the United States to load, to upload more missiles, more warheads on each missile, thereby giving the United States a particular counterforce advantage. And so therefore Russia potentially seeks to reduce that upload potential essentially in reducing the U.S. Hedge force. So I think I'll stop there, and I think I'll turn it over to James to talk about some of how the recommendations, how we sort of work through these issues.
I should say before I get into the meat of this that this was today was the first time I actually saw the front cover of the report. And I noticed that the front cover says a report of the Next Generation Working Group rather than the report of the Next Generation Working Group. So if this is John and Clark's subtle way of hinting to me and Mike that we have more work to do, then I'm marginally worried about that. Anyway, one thing I want to emphasize is how much this group disagreed on, and in spite of that, what we could agree on. In particular, this group as a whole vehemently disagreed over the merits or otherwise of the pursuit of abolition as a policy. Some of us thought it was a very good idea, some of us thought it was a terrible idea. But in spite of disagreeing over the merits of abolition, we could all agree that further arms control is in the US national interest. And what Mike has discussed is the challenges to that. And at the heart is this asymmetry. Russia is fundamentally worried about US conventional forces. ballistic missile defense, conventional prompt global strike, perhaps conventional forces in Europe. The United States is fundamentally worried about Russian nuclear forces. And that asymmetry is going to make the next round of arms control extremely difficult. And what I want to do is talk through some of the ideas that we've come up with, as well as recommendations related to the process of arms control, that we believe are a possible way through this asymmetry that makes the next round difficult. And I'm going to end by talking briefly about the US arsenal and stockpile stewardship, which, for reasons that I'll explain, is intimately connected to issues of arms control. One thing you're not going to hear from me today is numbers. We have not attempted to make recommendations about how many warheads or launchers or delivery vehicles the US and Russia should aim for. That's going to be a fundamentally political part of the negotiation. We don't think there's actually much policy. We'd rather debate the concepts than numbers that are going to be determined by a negotiating process. So our recommendations fall into four main areas. First, limits on launchers and delivery vehicles. These create predictability and hence enhance strategic stability, as Mike has already explained. So in keeping with New START, and unlike the Moscow Treaty, we support the continuation of limits on launchers and delivery vehicles. We think an enhanced verification regime that would be even better than New START, particularly in regards to the number of inspections and the access during conversion or elimination inspections, would be in the US interest. Generally, we support the absence of sublimits. Prior to the Moscow Treaty, there was a goal of trying to make the US and Soviet, then Russian force structures as similar as possible. We think as numbers come lower, it is better to allow each side to decide what its optimum force structure is, so long as those forces are primarily orientated to second strike. And in that regard, as Mike has already said, the one particular kind of sublimit that we do like and we do support would be a ban on new deployments of silo-based MIRVed ICBMs. They are extremely unsurvivable forces, and hence eliminating them would do a great deal to enhance crisis stability. Second issue, warheads. As a number of commentators have recently, we propose that the next treaty should aim for 2 limits on warheads. As with New START and the Moscow Treaty before it, we support a limit on strategic deployed warheads. In addition to that, we support a higher limit on all warheads, deployed, non-deployed, strategic, and tactical. Let me talk briefly about the upper limit. The first thing to say is that the US retains a large number of non-deployed warheads as a hedge against a failure in a warhead type and geopolitical risk. And at the end, I'm going to discuss an alternative form of risk mitigation that we think is a better form of risk mitigation than a large non-deployed stockpile. But the advantages of having a single limit encompassing all warheads we see as being threefold. Firstly, the distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear warheads is entirely artificial. And a single limit on all warheads would by bringing all warheads into arms control, would remove this artificial distinction. Secondly, this proposal would manage US and Russian concerns simultaneously. The United States and its allies, as Mike has already said, is worried about Russia's larger number of tactical nuclear weapons. Russia is worried about the United States' large number of non-deployed strategic warheads and the fact that they could be uploaded onto missiles in a crisis. Having a single proposal that deals with both non-deployed strategic and tactical warheads simultaneously helps manage both sides' concerns. It's a win-win, as the Chinese like to say. And finally, there are verification advantages to this proposal. We think dealing with trying to negotiate a limit on tactical warheads and a separate limit on all strategic warheads would for various reasons be unverifiable, and attempting to have a single limit on all warheads would be much easier for a verification point of view. Of course, verification would still be a big challenge, and I want to talk about how to develop a verification regime for all warheads in a minute. Third issue, ballistic missile defense. The NGWG fully supports ongoing US-Russia cooperation efforts on ballistic missile defense. We think they are a good idea, and we will hope they will succeed. We are skeptical they will succeed by themselves, and so we have tried to think of additional ideas related to ballistic missile defense that might do something to help assuage Russian fears and would be saleable about a mile down the road. It's very easy to think of proposals that would assuage Russian fears, and it's very easy to think of proposals that would be saleable in Congress. Trying to think of proposals that do both things simultaneously is much harder. But we come up with two ideas. First, we note as an empirical matter that the size, the composition, the technology, the capability, and the geographic location of US BMD systems appear to matter to Moscow. Moscow has not said all BMD systems are equally bad. We think, therefore, that much more thought could be given within the United States government and the Department of Defense as to how to deploy BMD capabilities, both the interceptors themselves and enabling systems such as radar, that helped the US demonstrate to Russia that these systems do not pose a threat to its second strike capability. A second idea is that the United States, this really picks up on an idea from the Bush administration, should very deliberately and very publicly tie the size and technological sophistication of the BMD system it will deploy to the evolution of the ballistic missile threat. The idea here is obvious, that by saying to Russia, the worse the threat becomes, the more sophisticated the systems we will employ will be, the US can hopefully incentivize Russia to play a more active role in ballistic missile, to combat ballistic missile proliferation. So, for instance, we believe that the US should give Russia politically binding assurances. We're not talking about a legally binding treaty here. We believe Russia should give politically binding assurances that the US will not deploy boost phase systems until a threat that can only be defeated with boost phase systems emerges. We think the US should continue to develop boost phase systems, which we see as being ultimately the only theoretical way ever of undermining the Russian deterrent. We believe the US should continue to develop these systems, but not to deploy these systems unless a threat emerges that requires that. And, you know, as part of these politically binding assurances, the US should emphasize that this is a sovereign US decision when it's going to deploy these systems, and also that it will deploy them in time for the threat. It won't wait until the threat emerges. But to help Russia understand the basis for US decision-making, we think it would also be helpful to establish a formal mechanism to share intelligence on ballistic missile proliferation between the United States and Russia, so that Russia can better understand why the US is making the decisions it is. The fourth issue is conventional prompt global strike. That is US high-precision conventional weapons designed to be able to hit a target anywhere in the world within an hour. Under New START, the United States agreed to count unguided, conventionally armed ballistic missiles under the New START central limits. But the US has made it clear that a more exotic form of system, boost glide systems, would not be counted under New START central limits. Subsequently, the US announced that it wasn't going to be pursuing unguided, conventionally armed ballistic missiles and would instead focus on boost glide. So for that reason, boost glide is clearly going to be a big issue, we believe, in the next round of arms control. We, the Next Generation Working Group, can agree in principle that all conventional prompt global strike systems should be counted under the central limits of a new treaty. There was a disagreement amongst the group that we could not resolve about how high the limit would have to be. Some members of the group believe that there would never be an incentive for CPGS to be expanded beyond a niche capability. There wouldn't be the money to expand it apart from anything else. And consequently, that part of the group believes that you could have the limit for strategic deployed warheads at or below new start levels and still include all CPGS systems within that limit. A second part of the group believe the United States should keep open the option to expand CPGS deployments significantly in future in the face of anti-access area denial capabilities. Consequently, that side of the group did not oppose counting CPGS under the limits, all CPGS systems under the limits of a future treaty, but said that that limit might have to be higher than under New START in order to give space for the US to have the systems that it needed. One thing we could all agree upon was that greater transparency by the US about conventional prompt global strike might help ease Russian fears. We could all agree that the United States should provide Russia with continuously updated information about the planned overall direction of conventional prompt global strike, and also that it should grant Russia a limited number of inspections and/or exhibitions of CPGS systems and bases, provided such inspections and exhibitions are commensurate with US proprietary and security requirements. So those are the kind of broad components of agreements that we see. But much is going to depend on the process of the next round of arms control. That process will be difficult. It is possible, in fact, it's inevitable, it will be contentious. And there is the risk, if the process is not properly designed, that it could actually make US-Russia relations worse than they are today. That said, on balance, we firmly believe that the risks of not doing further arms control outweigh the risks of trying to do further arms control. Russian fears about ballistic missile defense and CPGS are not going to go away if the United States refuses to engage in further arms control. US fears and the fears of US allies about tactical nuclear weapons are not going to go away if the two sides refuse to engage in further arms control. So although this is likely to be a difficult and contentious process, we firmly believe it is better to try it than not to try it. That said, arms control in future doesn't have to look the same as it has in the past. We think this this round of negotiations is unlikely to culminate in a single uber agreement covering every issue. We think a better target, in a way I will explain below, is to aim for a number of smaller, legally binding agreements covering one subset of the issues. Moreover, we firmly believe that the goal of negotiations should be a legally binding agreement, or agreements, except where ballistic missile defense is concerned. However, we believe that the two sides should agree that the goal of a legally binding agreement should not prejudice the development of more informal transparency and confidence-building measures. We do not see informal transparency and confidence-building measures as being in conflict or in contradiction to the goal of a legally binding treaty. On the contrary, as I'm going to explain in a second, transparency and confidence-building measures can be both useful deliverables in themselves and make a formal legally binding treaty easier to achieve. And one thing we would very much hope to see the sides do as they negotiate is focus on the development of informal confidence and security building measures. For instance, I cannot tell you today that a verification regime capable of accounting for all warheads that it's possible. I can't tell you it's not possible either. Instead, what we believe is that the US and Russia should work together, the US and Russian technical specialists, away from the negotiating table, to jointly develop a verification regime for all warheads in a step-by-step way. For instance, a good first step would be for the two sides to try and verify the absence of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, at bases where they are no longer stored. Following the presidential nuclear initiatives in 91 and 92, both sides say they have withdrawn tactical nuclear weapons from certain bases. Verifying that there are no longer tactical weapons at those bases would be a relatively straightforward challenge because you're verifying empty buildings. And it would be useful for both sides. Russia would get to see that the US has withdrawn tactical nuclear weapons from areas of Europe, which Russia has said is something it's concerned about. The United States would get to see that Russia has indeed fulfilled those parts of the presidential nuclear initiatives that Russia has said it has fulfilled. If you could successfully prototype that and demonstrate the ability to verify the absence of tactical nuclear weapons, the next step would be to agree to consolidate tactical nuclear weapons in centralized storage. And again, by verifying their absence at other places, you could make that agreement verifiable. And then that would help you build up to the real big challenge, which is counting the number of warheads in those centralized storage. As I say, we think the way to tackle these very difficult verification problems is not by sitting around a table and negotiating solutions, but by getting down on the ground, scientists getting their hands dirty, developing and trialing a regime in a step-by-step way. So in terms of how the process would look, we think a good starting point would be for the US and Russia to scope out the overall direction of negotiations in the Arms Control and International Security Working Group of the US and Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission. What we would recommend they agree upon would be a 3 or 4 track process. In exactly the same way that the nuclear and space talks that began in 1985 had 3 separate tracks: strategic nuclear forces, intermediate nuclear forces, and defense and space. In exactly the same way that had 3 tracks, and those issues were dealt with in separate tracks, and then gradually the linkage between the 3 tracks was removed, allowing INF and then START to be concluded. A similar structure we think would be useful here. And in particular, we think the 3 or 4 relevant tracks would be, firstly, how to define and verify a single limit on all warheads. Secondly, a track on strategic stability, discussing conventional prompt global strike and force structure issues. And thirdly, a track on ballistic missile defense. Now, obviously, the BMD track could fit under the rubric of strategic stability. We think it's helpful to separate it for a few reasons. Firstly, BMD is such an important issue, it probably deserves to be dealt with by itself. Secondly, the aim with BMD should not be to have a legally binding agreement limiting BMD, which makes it a fundamentally different kind of negotiation or discussion from the other tracks. And in addition to that, the discussions over BMD, I want to emphasize, should be to supplement the on-the-ground efforts about cooperation that are already going on. Now, this is not instead of cooperation, this is as well as cooperation. And finally, if Russia insists on linking conventional forces Europe issue into nuclear arms control discussions, then you're going to clearly need a 4th track on CFE issues, presumably under the auspices of the Organization for Cooperation and Security in Europe, with all the allies present. On the note on mentioning the allies, let me say very briefly that engagement with allies to make sure they're happy with all these proposals is another very important part of the US process. Briefly, and I apologize for talking too long, let me discuss issues of stockpile stewardship. As I've mentioned earlier, the NGWG believes in negotiating a single limit on all warheads. And more than that, we believe that we support the goal of significant reductions in the US non-deployed stockpile, providing the US can have an alternative risk mitigation strategy. As I've explained earlier, that non-deployed stockpile acts as a risk mitigator to both geopolitical risk and technical risk. So currently, the US method of stockpile stewardship is described as science-based. That is to say, the US tries to understand from a scientific level how warheads work, how they age. And if it discovers a problem, then in periodic life extension programs, those problems are corrected. The LEPs, the life extension programs, coupled with limited direct surveillance of the stockpile, have, in the absence of explosive testing, so far kept the US stockpile reliable. What we propose is an evolution. Let me emphasize this is evolutionary enhancements to this model of stockpile stewardship, and it's something that we call SUAS, scientific-based understanding and engineering-based sustainment of the US stockpile. And what SUAS means is we believe the US should develop a trickle capability. So it is able to what we term refabricate warheads. So the image we have is the US will refabricate warheads continually. And on a one-for-one basis, replace new refabricated warheads with old warheads from the stockpile. The nuclear explosive packages to these refabricated warheads should be manufactured according to existing trusted designs, while improvements could be made to the non-nuclear subsystems that improve reliability, safety, and security. To ensure consistency with current national policy, changes to non-nuclear components should improve neither the military characteristics of the warheads nor create the need for explosive testing. In other words, what we're essentially saying is take the life extension programs that happen at the moment and are discrete entities and expand them over a much longer period of time. What we're proposing does not involve building newer warheads than under existing policy. Our proposal is not about building new warheads or not building new warheads. It's about taking the changes that the US already makes under life extension programs, but refabricating warheads continuously. And what that would mean is that if you refabricated every warhead in the US stockpile, say once every 40 years, then no warhead in the US stockpile would be older than 40 years. This could be implemented once the chemistry and metallurgy replacement at Los Alamos and the UPF at Y-12 are completed. We believe this model is good for both the viability of the stockpile and for arms control. It's good for the viability of the stockpile for a couple of reasons. Firstly, if no warhead in the US stockpile was older than some limit, you wouldn't have to worry about aging effects any longer. Many of you will know the controversies related to plutonium aging in warheads. The Scientific Advisory Board, Gerson, has said that plutonium aging is not a problem, and that pits could last around about potentially over 100 years. During our work, where we visited Sandia and Los Alamos, that opinion was not shared by many of the people that we interacted with, who are concerned about plutonium aging. Now, I have a PhD in theoretical condensed matter physics, and I can say with absolute confidence that it's impossible to have any idea who's right about this without access to a huge amount of classified material. So we believe that what's in the US national interest is no longer to have this debate, but rather by refabricating warheads so that no warhead was older than, say, 40 years, just to completely bypass any concerns about plutonium aging. Secondly, we also see a risk under the existing model of stockpile stewardship that future life extension projects will not use every possible skills base. For instance, if the number of warheads, types of warheads in the US stockpile continues to decrease, life extension projects may not take place continually. There could be gaps between life extension projects, and critical skills could be allowed to atrophy. Imagine, for instance, that the US discovered that there was a problem with a warhead and believed the best way of rectifying that problem would be to build a whole number of new components, nuclear or non-nuclear, relatively quickly. If it couldn't do that because the relevant skills base had atrophied, then the US might be in the position of needing to test. You know, the US has always, even administrations that have supported the CTBT, have always said in extremis, we reserve the right to test, pull out of the CTBT if necessary. And we think that's most likely to happen in that kind of scenario. So by ensuring that all skills bases are used continuously, our model SUEZ, we believe, is an enhancement to this, it's an improvement above the status quo. We also believe that our model of SUEZ is good for arms control. By building increased confidence in the viability of the stockpile amongst those who are currently responsible for certifying it, and that's crucial. By building confidence amongst that group, it's much easier to make a persuasive case for deep reductions to the non-deployed stockpile. The Obama administration has argued that rather than having a large number of warheads as a geopolitical hedge, if the US were to have a responsive, revitalized infrastructure that could respond to changes in the security environment, it could do without so many non-deployed warheads. You know, we believe our proposal is very much fulfilling that vision. Right now, there's a huge asymmetry between the US and Russian models of stockpile management. The Russian model actually does look very similar to what we propose at the moment. Russia refabricates its warheads according to unclassified sources once every 10 to 15 years. So Russia has a very small number of non-deployed warheads and quite a large production capability. The US has a very small production capability and a large number of non-deployed warheads. That asymmetry makes arms control extremely difficult. SUEZ, by narrowing this asymmetry, would make arms control easier. And finally, we say unashamedly, we see SUEZ as a crucial element in a political bargain. If arms controllers want deeper reductions in the non-deployed stockpile, they will have to give something in return for that. And we see a trade-off, and this is very directly how we as the NGW see it, is a political trade-off between significant reductions in the non-deployed stockpile and an enhanced model of stockpile stewardship. Let me close by emphasizing what Mike pointed out right at the beginning, which is we see arms control primarily and fundamentally as being about enhancing national security, US national security. And when you look at the range of proposals that we've put today, relating from enhanced verification of strategic forces, enhanced predictability, the inclusion of tactical nuclear weapons in arms control, an enhanced model of stockpile stewardship, we see this package as a whole as very firmly enhancing the national security of the United States and of its allies through arms control. With apologies for speaking, both of us, considerably longer than I think we were planning to, we'd be absolutely delighted to take questions. John or Clark, is one of you going to moderate the discussion? Okay, well, in that case, I'll sit down then. Any questions? Do you want to, the microphone is just coming through.
Although this development occurred largely after you completed work on your study, how does the prospect of a defense drawdown in the United States affect Russia's calculations with respect to the negotiation?
You know, I partly echo what Mike just said to me quietly now, which was he has no idea.
So I gave it to him.
I mean, let me say firstly, I think it's too early to know. Secondly, I think Russian concerns about NATO's forces in particular are what you might term structural. It's a fundamental fear of encirclement. It's a fear of just being a company like surrounded by countries, at least to the west, with much larger economies and much larger conventional forces. So I would, if I were a betting man, I would bet that US reductions in the defense budget, and indeed those in Europe, would probably not significantly affect Russian threat perceptions. But I emphasize that's very speculative.
Thank you for your comments today. Very interesting. I'm Tracy Wilson from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I'm looking forward to reading your report. I'm sure that there's lots of good things in there. One question for you. The responsive architecture approach that you mentioned. I seem to recall that from a few years back, and to follow up on Clark's question, you were heading into financial straits here in the future. Infrastructure tends to be very expensive. That'll be hard to swallow in budget bills to come. I'm also curious about how this might be seen going into the 2015 RevCon in terms of our Article 6 obligations. Does this look to the outside world as something threatening?
Yeah, I might take this. The administration has obviously already committed to securing funding for CMRR and UPF. Whether Congress will continue to fund that remains to be seen. I think the advantage of what we're proposing is you can fund it with funding that has if all the funding that has already been promised comes through and CMRR and UPF are completed, then using them on a continual basis, because at that point it's not infrastructure, would be a relatively small marginal cost. And certainly, the committee as a whole, in supporting Suez in return for significant reductions in non-deployed warheads, supports the funding in CMRR and UPF. Whether the politics is going to be conducive to that, I mean, your guess is as good as mine. As far as 2015 goes, I'd make, personally I would encourage the US to come out on the offensive on this and make a number of points. Firstly, Suez does not involve new warheads. It is exactly as the US does at the moment. Where it remanufactures the nuclear explosive packages, we support doing it according to existing designs, and only making changes to supplement safety, security, and reliability, not new military capabilities. That's worth emphasizing. It's worth emphasizing that Russia has a very similar model, and nobody complains about that. And more generally, abolition, and here I'm speaking personally, abolition is not about merely verifiably dismantling warheads. It's about creating the security conditions that would enable a world without nuclear weapons to be at least as safe as a world with nuclear weapons. And that's going to be a long and slow process. And the US is, if it gets seriously down on that path, is likely to be at low numbers for a relatively long period of time. And a more robust form of stockpile management would enhance strategic stability at lower numbers by reducing any possible incentives to start putting numbers up again. Russia has a larger production capability than the US, so gradually equalizing that gap, to my mind, makes the world a safer place at lower numbers and is not inconsistent with going to zero. I grant you many non-nuclear weapon states will necessarily agree with that analysis, but I think as part of a package of measures related to Article 6, which the administration supports, it's the kind of idea which, if explained in the right way, would not be diplomatic dynamite.
I just want to add, an interesting point about Suez and that the working group sort of agreed to that is that we do have people on sort of both sides of the political spectrum with quite different views on the issue of abolition, which is why we couldn't agree to it, have any significant agreement on it as an endpoint. What's interesting about Suez is that, and from the perspective of the group and the dynamics that existed within the group, is that those who believe in abolition as an endpoint, like James, who's written about, endorses this kind of recommendation and believes in it because of the political recognition, as James said, that there is a trade-off. You can't simply reduce the non-deployed stockpile to assuage Russian concerns about upload potential and not do anything to not do anything on the other side, and that there is this sort of fundamental trade-off. So it's a dynamic that sort of we think it's a very honest sort of recommendation, in that you had people who both thought reductions and abolition are a bad idea on one end, and people who thought you should reduce unilaterally regardless of what you do to put in place of it. So we see it as a sort of honest, from the perspective of the group, very kind of honest proposal that kind of satisfies the reality of that important trade-off.
Yes, Burgess Slater with Johns Hopkins. I first would like to congratulate you on what appears to be a superb report, full of all sorts of strengths. I do have a question, and on that notion, one of the things that makes it truly superb is the recognition and the call for a step-by-step process. Transparency and confidence-building measures going out to Nevada or Semipalatinsk or wherever we happen to go and conducting verification experiments, because the science just simply isn't there for the single warhead approach quite yet. But I think that that's an excellent recognition and long overdue in a public report. Second, I do have a question on the single warhead limit with the deployed strategic warheads counting, if you will, a sublimit on those. Did you do anything about the heavy bomber rule? Because heavy bombers are one of those aspects that have been privileged in your language to date for stability purposes. But if we're counting real warheads and not counting one heavy bomber equals one weapon/bomb, I'm just wondering how the group handled, do we count them individually? Do we stick with the current rule, or do we perhaps go back to the old START rule of 14 for Russians, Soviets, 10 for us? Thank you.
That was actually one of the issues we couldn't agree on. There were two approaches. I should say, if you're having a single limit on all warheads and a limit on strategic deployed warheads, you run into a verification difficulty, which is what happens if you have tactical and strategic warheads deployed at the same bomber base, which was the issue we grappled with a bit. So we see two potential solutions to this. One is simply to continue the bomber rule of counting each bomber as one strategic deployed warhead, as with New START. The upper limit, you're clearly saying a warhead is a warhead. No matter where that warhead is, no matter what it is, you're actually counting every honest-to-God warhead in the country to go towards the upper limit. But some of us said, for the lower limit, you should continue the rule that a deployed heavy strategic bomber counts as one deployed strategic warhead. The other approach was to say all warheads at bomber bases should count as strategic warheads, because you can't really distinguish between strategic and tactical warheads, so you just say all warheads at bomber bases count towards that lower limit. I think both of those are technically workable. The question becomes, do you like bombers so much you want to prioritize them, which I think was behind some people supporting one limit, or do you think there's an advantage to counting, trying to get as close to genuine warhead counting as possible, in which case you support the second option? I think both of those are workable. We couldn't quite agree on it, but we think there's two approaches there that could conceivably work in negotiations. Yes.
Robert Gard, Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. I have read that the Russians have wanted either written assurance or a legally binding document or some sort of documentation that we aren't targeting their strategic forces with our missile defenses. Now, I don't think we have any intent of targeting their strategic forces with our missile defenses, yet people seem to dismiss this option as being impossible or unrealistic. Why?
Just to clarify, people seem to dismiss which option?
The option of providing them with some written statement that says, nope, we're not targeting your strategic forces with our missile defenses.
I mean, as James indicated, I mean, we, on the issue of BMD, see a politically binding agreement, but not a legally binding agreement regarding BMD. I mean, I think well, one is not written, and a treaty would be signed and time limited and things like that. One would be a statement by the president that we don't seek to do so, but it's it's not written down, it's not formalized in international law. I think it comes down to domestic politics. I mean, we were in our discussions and in discussions with experts, it just became very clear that as the debate over New START forcefully demonstrated, the issue of BMD is this kind of signature issue for some in this country, and particularly some in Washington, and that there was simply no way that there was going to be a future treaty that another treaty that had formal, legally binding limitations on U.S. BMD capabilities. And with that, I mean, we just assume that if some in the Senate were going to raise issues of the silo conversion ban as reasons why they shouldn't ratify this, that any meaningful limit on the deployment of U.S. BMD capabilities would simply not be feasible. So we sought to sort of develop other ways in which, other confidence building measures, other ways in which we could assure Russia of, I agree with you that at least at this point there is no intent on building such a capability to undermine Russia's deterrent. Nevertheless, the Russians seem concerned about it, and so we have to address those concerns. One of the things that we discuss in the report, as James pointed out, is that the size and location matters, so limiting locations and radar deployments in ways in which that they would not be as threatening to Russia. So we tried to come up with ways in which we could do things that would both attempt to alleviate or assuage some of Russia's concerns and, importantly, be saleable in the United States during the ratification process. And that's about as best as we could do.
I'll make 3 points incredibly quickly. Firstly, the idea of legally binding assurances, written assurances the U.S. wouldn't target Russian strategic forces. only became public fairly late in our process. So we actually didn't discuss that idea as a working group. So the rest of my answer is my personal opinion rather than the working group's opinion. Secondly, I've wondered exactly the same thing you have, which is would this be such a politically impossible suggestion? I mean, I note that everybody in the administration that I've spoken to assumes that it would be politically impossible, but none of them have ever, that's kind of assumed wisdom rather than having been tested, I think. What I would say is I genuinely question how much difference that would make to the Russian threat perception. I mean, Russian concerns about BMD, at least as I understand them, the fundamental one is that if BMD got more and more sophisticated and was then expanded very quickly, it could pose a threat to Russia's deterrent. And I question whether a promise in any form by the US that it wouldn't target Russian forces would really ease Russian fears. So.
Saying that during negotiations, the United States shouldn't give these up for possibly afterwards, given up certain important areas. You then mentioned this would have to be followed by some sort of visible or tangible alternative that also involves reliance and burden sharing. So I was wondering if you got far enough within the report or within your thinking as to what exactly those would be. I think we all know what the tangible, visible, and burden sharing option is now. If you're going to replace it with something, what exactly would that be?
We, in the discussions of the group spent most of its time on this issue focusing on the wisdom of whether or not the United States should even consider the removal of these weapons. It was recognized that the removal of these weapons, at least from the perspective of the United States, would not denuclearize NATO per se, because there were other capabilities that would provide a credible extended deterrent. But nevertheless, that there would be some way in which both allies and adversaries would need to sort of continue to understand that this dynamic existed. So the answer is honestly we didn't get that far in it, but one example that was discussed at some length in the group was, and this is a very difficult one, but was getting the NATO allies to commit more of their defense budgets to the NATO mission. If the United States is going to, provide funds for these capabilities, or if they're just going to withdraw, then there needs to be some other way of doing it, and one way of doing it is contributing to more greater NATO. Now, we recognize, you smile, and of course, that's a very unlikely thing to do, but nevertheless, many in the group also said that we should not allow NATO to just rest comfortably under letting the United States be the sole nuclear executioner or potential executioner, and rest comfortably under this commitment based on these weapons in Europe. And so there was a strong sort of thread running through that debate about if NATO is going to continue to exist as a sort of real functioning alliance with military capabilities, that the NATO allies would have to do more, and that allowing them to rest comfortably under this with these weapons in Europe was not a good solution for the United States or for them. That's, to be honest, about as far as we got. I mean, I think I can come up with some of my own. I'm sure James can come up with some of his own, but I'm just trying to speak for sort of how the group thought about this and how the debate went during that discussion. Let's go Hans, just because you have the mic already.
All right. I'll do without the mic as well. Well, thanks very much for your work there, and for whatever else comes after. But I have two questions. One is about this issue of disparity and the issue of, well, generally speaking, everything for that matter, but particularly in non-strategic nuclear weapons, where I'm after whether you think disparity is an issue or not an issue. Because it seems to me that in the debate, in the discussion about it right now, it obviously is something that's been singled out, et cetera. Yet in recommending the
disparity would not be an issue. Can you talk about how you struggle with that, or whether you discussed it, or and on the other part, on this issue of what you call the refabricated warhead idea, how is it different from the existing plan? I'm listening to what you're saying and finding very little that's different from what we see in the Stockpile Stewardship Management Plan. And are there any limits to, for example, what we see as life extension warhead ideas now, opposed to now, compared to what you're thinking about? For example, if you're talking about refabricating warhead production, does that include a common warhead, for example, such as the idea of producing a common warhead between the ICBMs and which is currently not in the stockpile?
Let me take the second question first. The current plan still envisages discrete life extension programs, which are very long lead time. The actual operational phase is, a few years long, but is a discrete thing. And then it's being marketed that, you do the life extension project and you then leave that warhead in the stockpile for however many decades it is, and then you do another life extension project further down the line. The critical difference between what we propose and the status quo is what is our model of refabrication it would essentially make those LEPs last much longer. The US would be at continually and slowly refabricating warheads. And secondly, existing LEPs, for instance, might not fabricate pits from scratch. They might reuse existing pits. We're saying that when you're doing that, you should refabricate. You should make sure every part of that warhead is refabricated from its precursor materials. So those are the two critical differences. And as I say, if you had the differences become very significant, say the US reduced the number of types of warhead in the arsenal, and there were no longer enough warhead types under the existing model for LEPs to be continuous. You might have significant stretches of time when the labs were not really being used, and skills bases would atrophy as they have done in the past. And that's a weakness of the existing model. If you are continually refabricating, then you're continually making sure those skills bases are being exercised. So, I don't want to make out that what we're proposing is radically new or radically different. It's not. It's evolutionary. But there are definite and meaningful differences from the status quo that I hope I now made clear. As to issues about, we did not discuss, and so I'm not going to comment on particular issues about whether this LEP is the right thing to do or whether you should go to a common warhead. Our approach is kind of at a lower level. It's whatever the US decides to do, whatever's going to be in the stockpile, whatever final decisions about warhead types and what you're going to do in a LEP are made. That's made as it is at the moment. We don't propose changing any of that. We didn't discuss whether we should change any of that. It's whatever you're doing, whatever types you've decided upon, you should have a trickle production capability and continuously be refabricating whatever you have in the stockpile. Mike, did you want to answer the first question?
Sure. I think that the issue on the disparity, there was great debate as to whether or not it mattered at all. And there were some people who said this asymmetry in TNW just doesn't really matter, which is why we put in the report, the language specific, the perceived threat to some U.S. allies. I think the issue is that without a new agreement such that we proposed, you have essentially relative symmetry and capabilities, or relative symmetry and capabilities under New START at the strategic level, and then you just allow this asymmetry, which seems to sort of matter more if the strategic level is relatively equal. So a single limit essentially just forces both sides to make great choices, and the assumption is that if the Russians chose to have X amount of TNW at the expense of longer range forces that could hold the United States at risk, then that was a choice that they were making, and that the choice that we would make, holding, that a greater number of intercontinental range systems would simply offset that threat and potentially give the United States, greater it would allow the United States to hold more of Russia at risk than they could hold of us at risk if they chose to preference TNW or not. So it's basically just forcing them to make a choice, and we didn't really get into whether or not any of those we didn't see that there was a way in which any of the choices that Russia would make would disadvantage U.S. national security or that of its allies in any particular way.
Let me just add one thing really quickly, which is one of the things we really tried to do with this report was accept the complexity of the politics surrounding arms control and come up with proposals that could conceivably work politically. And the reality is that the Senate, in its resolution of advice and consent to ratification, made a big deal about the disparity. Allies make a big deal about the disparity. We did not think it would be politically credible to come up with something that did not address that disparity, whether or not you strategically think it matters. And frankly, it seems good to use the politics to back arms control. I mean, if the Senate is calling for dealing with the disparity, then why not make a proposal that deals with what the Senate says is one of its main goal for the next treaty?
Thank you for your comments today. It's always interesting to think about arms control in a vacuum, and many pieces of research do this. But could you please comment about the overarching security institutions that we deal with today? NATO was mentioned in the report briefly, but I'm curious to know, in your research, if our decision-making apparatus has a certain sensitivity for the different frame of reference of the Russian government. For example, North Korea is now a nuclear power. Iran is a nuclear power. Russian foreign policy is oriented toward a near-abroad policy. And NATO hasn't changed that much since the Cold War, but other Russian security interests have. Can you comment on that?
I'll take a brief stab at it. James probably have a comment or two on this. I mean, the answer is yes, we did consider, to the extent we could, Russian perspectives on this, which is why in sort of creating the group, we had a couple experts on Russia who were more kind of Russia people than nuclear people who knew the nuclear stuff, but were really experts on Russia. And of course, we traveled, a group of us traveled to Russia for discussions there. So we did really try to take their considerations into account in coming up with what was saleable and what was actually doable, which is why our focus is on sort of practical, potentially actionable recommendations. And so from that perspective, we do say that one of the things, as an example, one of the things that's going to make TNW negotiations so difficult from the Russian perspective is that while you don't hear as much publicly, privately, Russians are deeply concerned about China. And that some would say that perhaps Russia's interest in maintaining a reasonably sizable arsenal of TNW is to deal with the potential threat from China, and thus they're not as concerned about Russia, about NATO, despite the fact that they raised that issue. There may be greater concern there. So we did factor that in, and we do discuss a little bit of all the reasons why negotiations, particularly on TNW, are going to be challenging. We tried to bring in Russia's perspective. Similarly, although we criticize Russia's apparent funding, or at least initial research and development funding for a new liquid-fueled, silo-based MERVed ICBM to replace the SS-18, while we criticize that, we also say, but we understand, or we think we understand, or have a sense of, why they're doing this. It's in budget. There's a bureaucratic momentum, number one, and budgetary reasons, number two, and thus we propose, as an effort to create a workable solution, a ban on new types of silo-based, of these kinds of systems, thus sort of potentially putting a ban on this new system, but nevertheless allowing Russia to keep the SS-18s through the end of their service lives to maintain warhead levels up to New START. So I think our recommendations did try to take into account Russian domestic politics and Russian sort of political and economic dynamics as well. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. You briefly mentioned China. Taking into account the goal of enhancing national security, what role, if any at all, did a potential arms race with China play in drafting your recommendations?
I think there's two things going on here. Right now, as of the 30th of September 2009, the US had exactly 5,113 nuclear weapons. The Russian numbers are believed to be roughly similar. Both sides have very big dismantlement queues, but even ignoring the thousands of weapons awaiting dismantlement, the US and Russia have round about 5,000 warheads apiece. China has, look up whatever Hans wrote most recently. I mean, round about 400 or so. In addition to that, the US and Russian arsenals are significantly more sophisticated and survivable by whatever attribute you want to have. There is a huge difference between the US and Russia and China and everybody else. So firstly, we believe that further steps in US-Russia arms control are in the US national interest, because anywhere the US and Russia are going to conceivably end up in the real world after the next round of negotiations, even if they're concluded quickly and successfully, there's still going to be a huge gap, qualitative and quantitative, between the US and Russia and everybody else. What we say in the report briefly is that said, we are fully in favor of, at the same time as US-Russia, trying to get something going as well on a more multilateral strand. The US and others, and Russia and others, do have valid concerns about the nuclear arsenals of other states. Russia would highlight the UK and France as well as China. So we're not in any way, we don't view US-Russia as being, you do that and you don't do anything else. We are in favor of doing US-Russia, and separately from that, we are in favor of a more creative multilateral process, which we do not sketch out in the report with any depth because it was to look at the next steps in US-Russia. But we don't view this as being either or. In an ideal world, we think you could work on both fronts at the same time. Whether that's politically feasible is a different story. But again, as I say, we think it's in the US national interest to do Russia, even if you can't get something started multilaterally. Yeah, sure.
But by entering into a legally binding agreement with Russia, the possibility is taken away from the United States to keep up with China or other countries that might start an arms race, because it's always bound by the agreement between Russia and the United States.
Right, and if Chinese numbers were roughly equivalent to US numbers, that would be a problem. But as I said, the number of, the US arsenal might be a factor of 20 larger than the Chinese arsenal. Like, there is no way for the foreseeable future that China can challenge the United States qualitatively or quantitatively.
I mean, the other point to make is that, this is not, this next round and what we propose in the next round is not like the last arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. I mean, it could be, but I mean, we don't envision it that way. Nothing, we explicitly did not want to get into numbers in this report. So we do not recommend a number that we should go down to 1,000 or this or that. But if you read, I think you can read through the lines and see that we are talking about, most of us had in our minds relatively modest reductions. So nothing in what we propose here would close the delta between the United States and China in a time-bound agreement that could last 7-10 years, probably at the most, that would create a situation in which China could speed up that quickly. So this is a relatively modest reduction, potentially relatively modest reduction. My personal view is the number shouldn't be 1,000 because it's too political. It should be 1,200 or 1,100 or 1,001, anything but 1,000, because it's such a sort of, we've got that number in our head, and it seems like there's a cliff at that number. But in any event, we don't get into numbers here, but we assume that it's going to be a relatively modest treaty, and that nothing in there would necessarily close that gap or potentially close that gap in the time frame in which this treaty might exist. That would do that. Now, of course, this treaty could things would have to be modified if you don't negotiate, if you don't begin negotiating this for 7 to 10 years, and lots of things have changed in China's capabilities, then your recommendations might be different. I mean, we sort of, you know, the challenge here is that we're talking about sort of near future negotiations, although recognizing, of course, that negotiations on the next round, if they ever get started, might not start in the next year or two, but could start 7, 8, 9, 10 years down the road. And the capabilities of Russia, of China, of other countries will affect the sort of longevity of these recommendations.
Was there something you wanted to add there? It kind of looked like you were desperate.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I would like to. I might be particularly pessimistic, but what about a simple allegiance between Russia and China? That would outnumber the U.S. weapons by a lot. Always under the assumption that this is to enhance national security.
Again, I'm not. I mean, the first point is, you know, let's. I don't think it would outnumber U.S. capabilities by a lot. You know, and okay, look, let me speak not as the chairman of the working group, because this was not an issue we discussed in the working group. Let me co-chairman. I'm sorry, Mike. let me talk as an individual here. U.S. forces, particularly the D5s, are exceptionally survivable and have an extremely robust hard target kill capability. How the addition of a handful of Chinese ICBMs that are not terribly accurate to the Russian arsenal. So if let's imagine for a second China and Russia are going to align politically against the US, which I would argue is not likely, but let's imagine for a second that that happened. How the addition of a handful of not terribly accurate Chinese ICBMs would change in some fundamental way the deterrent relationship between the US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, I just don't see it. I mean, you know, it's not as if with China's help, Russia could all of a sudden launch a disarming first strike on the US. So I'm not, you know, I'm just not sure why a US-Russia alliance would be so disastrous for strategic stability or international security.
Well, I mean, I think that the issue of security, in the report we focus mostly on concerns about the security of Russian weapons, but I mean, some could make the case about the security of the United States. Obviously, a couple incidents that suggested that security potentially is in jeopardy. I'm not as skeptic. I'm not as a big believer in that personally, but I think that basically the answer to the question is, I mean, since we did consider security, because we talked about as one potential step within this process, consolidation. So by consolidating to a couple of storage sites, you could focus all your, rather than covering, I don't know how many, Hans, 5 or 6 storage sites, that you could then focus all those efforts on protecting 1 or 2. So by reducing the number, if not with all-out withdrawal or elimination of those weapons, U.S. weapons in Europe, you would be able to increase the security of U.S. weapons by, again, concentrating resources on a fewer number of storage sites. I think that was our recommendation on the U.S. side. Did I miss anything on the Russian side?
Well, no, we saw it as consolidation on both sides allows both sides to expend limited resources on fewer sites, increasing security. Let me add very briefly. There's no good name for these weapons, but short range doesn't work because sea-launched cruise missiles are long-range weapons. I mean, Russian sea-launched cruise missiles, and the US doesn't have any of those left, but are longer than early sea-launched ballistic missiles. So short range doesn't really work either as a name. I mean, it's really weapons that for various reasons we've decided historically shouldn't have been included in arms control. And that's really the only thing that unites that category, but that name has never really caught on, so. Leonora at the back.
Prompt global strike. Was there a discussion about what kind of verification would be needed to allay fears of the impacts on strategic stability? And does that stem from Russia's concerns about the conventional capability against our conventional capability against its forces, or putting a nuclear weapon on the ability or possibility that we might put a nuclear weapon on this capability. And my second question is the refabrication of nuclear warheads. How does that affect stockpile stewardship? So is it more a shift to production and away from the direction of stockpile stewardship, or is it in addition to stockpile stewardship?
On the first question, I think one of the crucial things to be transparent about would be the type of warhead. Everybody thinks it's a very good idea, if you're going to have CPGS, to base the systems physically very separately from any deployment area where nukes are stored. And building Russian confidence in that would be, to my mind, a very worthwhile thing to do. We didn't discuss specific ideas beyond that. Speaking personally, if Russian concerns are about CPGS destroying silo-based missiles, if it is possible, and I'm speaking very personally, if it's possible to give Russia information about the form of US conventional warhead on a CPGS system so that Russia knows they're not capable of destroying silos, that's the kind of thing we need to look at. On the second issue, we see this as being enhancing the existing model of stockpile stewardship. The existing model of stockpile stewardship is fundamentally based on enhancing scientific understanding of the way warheads work. That's good. We think the US should continue to do that. In addition to that, we think it should have a comprehensive model of stockpile stewardship that places as much emphasis on the engineering aspects as it does on the scientific aspects. And so ensuring the US remains and continually utilizes a robust engineering base will help ensure over the long term the viability of the US stockpile without testing, without the need to build new nuclear weapons, which we as the NGWG, apart from anything else, think Congress is just not going to give permission for. So it's within the political constraints, and this is a very politically constrained area, as you know much better than I do, but within the politically constrained area, we think this will enhance stockpile stewardship while facilitating further arms control.
Stanley Kober. This is the Next Generation Working Group, okay? And so far you've been dealing entirely on U.S. Russia, isolated pretty much from the rest of the world, which was the traditional approach to arms control, the vertical proliferation, as opposed to the horizontal proliferation. And 20 years ago we were more focused on SALT, START, and so on, rather than the proliferation which happened subsequently. India, Pakistan, North Korea was mentioned. Now Iran, we're all worried about what happens then. And I'm curious about this. Why is the Next Generation Working Group so focused on this traditional agenda, or are you planning to look at the horizontal proliferation as well, and the intersection between the two, the U.S.-Russia, and how that affects nuclear proliferation more generally?
The short answer to your question is that that's the task we were given, was to look at next steps in U.S. Russian arms control. And so we were very careful in scoping this to focus just on that issue, recognizing that it's not the only issue out there, but nevertheless a commission that attempted to be the kind of grand theory or grand commission on everything nuclear, everything arms control, or everything proliferation was not going to be able to complete its work and provide robust recommendations. So the really easy answer is that we were tasked with this specific objective in our sort of explicit in the report, that we recognize that there's other things important, as James said. We're not certainly against or don't think that other arms control or other non-proliferation efforts are important. but it was just that we wanted to focus, and we were told to focus on a very narrow, a specific and narrow set of issues. I think a broader point to make is that one of the sort of things that we came to in this group, and James and I had been discussing this offline for a while now, is that there's a lot of discussion today about new ideas. We need to rethink deterrence. We need to rethink arms control. And at least in my personal view, those statements are kind of vacuous once you scratch the surface on some of these. I mean, there are some important differences that you have to consider. But in some ways, the way we focus on this report on things like strategic stability, which might be considered classical kind of things in the nuclear business, classical things about arms control, and sort of one of our sort of taglines that James created is that the new idea of the next generation is in fact that many of the old ideas are still relevant and applicable and useful. And so we want to bring in some new insights, but we don't think it's useful, applicable, necessary, or relevant to necessarily throw everything out and say, boy, that was the Cold War and this was different, and draw this sort of sharp line between the two. So a lot of what we drew on, a lot of our thinking came out of this sort of basic recognition that the environment's different. We need to think about some new solutions, but at the same time, some of the stuff from sort of our predecessors, from the old guard, so to speak, were still quite important and relevant, and that this idea of sort of tossing all that away and saying, let's get new minds to think completely new thoughts wasn't going to bear as much fruit as sort of borrowing on some of the key sort of insights from the past.
And let me add one thing to that. Of course, the world has changed incredibly since 1980. Pick your date towards the end of the Cold War. And the chance of major conflict between the U.S. and Russia has reduced dramatically, and we should all be incredibly grateful for that. But the chance of serious conflict between the U.S. and Russia has not gone away entirely. And both states still plan for the use of nuclear weapons against one another. So were international relations ever to deteriorate sharply, and the United States and Russia were in a crisis in which the use of nuclear weapons was still imaginable, and we believe that such crises could still occur, we want both sides to have their forces postured in such a way as to minimize any incentive to use nuclear weapons first, out of the fear that the other side was about to do so first. So to that extent, because serious crises are still possible, we do believe that crisis stability is still an important concept, and arms control has an important role to play in ensuring that if the worst kind of crisis happens, we have some chance of mitigating the worst kind of outcome. So to that extent, we are, I think, unashamed in saying that concepts about crisis stability and arms race stability, strategic stability, are not Cold War concepts. They are enduring concepts of continual value, and we have no problem in advocating them in today's security environment. Which is absolutely not to say that there are not other problems, and we're not saying this is the only nuclear problem. We're not saying there shouldn't be work on other fronts. But we do believe that U.S. Russia arms control continues to have an important role to play.
Was there one question? Was there? No? Okay. Sir?
Yes, James, thanks again for your comments. You just mentioned the possibility of a first strike, and that the incentive of your work is to minimize the temptation to use nuclear weapons in a first strike. But you are suggesting in this report consolidation of weapons. Wouldn't that decrease the survivability of an arsenal and kind of increase the temptation to be the first mover? So what gives, I guess, is the question.
We're talking specifically about consolidation of tactical nuclear weapons. The strategic forces, which, in this sense, the distinction is not so artificial, because U.S. strategic forces can hit the Russian mainland and Russian strategic forces can hit the U.S. mainland. Those are the weapons, rather than the tactical nuclear weapons, just because they are, apart from Slickums, of generally shorter range. Those are the strategic weapons that you'd want to, that would inevitably be used in in an exchange against one another. So we don't support consolidation of those weapons. We want to enhance the survivability of those weapons, which is why we're in favor of a ban on new deployments of silo-based MIRVed ICBMs. We think the strategic stability implications of consolidating tactical nuclear weapons, because they generally couldn't be used against one another's homeland, are not particularly deleterious.
Sir, did you have a final question?
Oh, you do that. Being in this forum, you compared U.S. versus, Russian concerns, concerning strategic, stability, and you also alluded to the fact that Russia is more reliant on its tactical nuclear weapons. Did you, in your travels with your Russian counterparts, did you get the sense that they also have more concern regarding disclosure of sensitive information concerning their nuclear weapon storage bins and operations, as opposed to the U.S. being a little more transparent, concerning how we track our stockpile? Say anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that we asked, because we wanted to get better insight, and how do you think about TNW? I mean, you can read the literature so there's very good literature by, sort of U.S.-based scholars talking about the Russians' view. Some will say it's really all about, Russian TNWs are all about China. Others would say, no, it may be about China, but they're really concerned about Europe, and this is to offset conventional weaknesses vis-a-vis the United States and NATO. And we couldn't get, in our discussions, a really good answer on that. And whenever we raised, or whenever a couple of us raised the issue of, well, how are you thinking about TNW with regard to China? It just wasn't a discussion to be had. Like, we just couldn't get any traction on that. The line that they held, John, Caroline, others, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, but the line that they held, to the extent we could get them to our Russian colleagues to talk about how they thought about TNW, it was mostly about offsetting conventional inferiorities vis-a-vis the United States and NATO. That was the line that they took on that. On the transparency issue, absolutely reluctance to talk about these things publicly. One of the things we said in the report was that such exchanges of information didn't need to be made public. So if Russia felt more confident exchanging this kind of information about size, disposition, location, whatever, but not it being some public document for the Chinese to see, for everyone else to see, that might perhaps make them slightly more comfortable. So we also just a line or two in there in the report about, we don't have to make all of this out in the open. If it just wants to stay sort of classified between the United States and Russia, if that would ease some of their concerns about this information sort of leaking to the broader public, or sort of Hans writing about it in the bulletin, that would that might make it a little easier. But that's about as far as we got on that.
I would like to just, as a closing comment, go back to the comment that was made at the back about why was the next generation looking at this particular problem, because I have to admit I was part of the groups that tasked to look at the next step in arms control. And the reason is we knew this was the next step. That is, that this is where our arms control establishment, our nuclear policy strategy establishment is going to be looking at. This is even before the New START ratification debate in the Senate. There are a number of different people who are looking at horizontal proliferation at this time. But we knew that the U.S. government and its Russian counterparts were going to be looking at the next round of negotiations between arms control, which was, at that time, viewed as a necessary precursor to anything that might be multilateral. And I think that what I was interested to see is if the next generation, which are usually not asked to form commissions to address these kind of policy issues, will generate some new thinking. And to me, I think there are some new thoughts in here. I also think it's important that some concepts that are older concepts were validated concepts. So I, for one, am very pleased with how this started during that time. Just to further ease James's mind, we said a report because we envision forming another next generation working group to address another topic. Perhaps not the same group addresses another topic, but another group addresses it with different co-chairs. And perhaps one might be a newer issue at that time. I think this was a group that throughout the year operated with tremendous professionalism, a great deal of attention to detail, a great deal of debate. It's something that they all did offline, so to speak, in addition to their regular jobs. I, for one, think it produced a very sound professional document, one that I personally, as a representative of CSIS, take pride in having helped facilitate its production. So I would like to thank James and Michael, and great job.